Good afternoon. Is everybody having a good time? How about a round of applause for a great couple of days that we've had? So Senator Cotton talked earlier today about some of those moments, some big, some small, where your life, your experience goes in very different directions. For me, one of them was in June of 2010. We had just started Heritage Action, and Tim Chapman and I went over and met with Barry Jackson, the Chief of Staff to then Speaker John Boehner. And Obamacare had just passed, and we went in there. We'd been working with now Secretary nominee for Health and Human Services, Tom Price. We went over to talk about some ideas that we'd been working with Tom Price on to repeal Obamacare. And we sat down with Barry and we talked about some of the things that we thought made sense and how we would queue up a great year and kind of the great process of pushing back on Obamacare. And Barry looked at us and he said, guys, we are not repealing Obamacare. He said, we will lose the 2010 election. I have seen the ads the labor unions will do if we try to repeal Obamacare. This was shocking to me. I had spent the last 2 years out in California. I was getting my MBA at Stanford Business Camp and came back. It appeared to me that Republicans had fought hard and just, of course, we're going to fight to repeal Obamacare. It set up a very different last 6.5 years at Heritage Action than I thought when I flew across the country from California to DC the last 6.5 years would be. I had previously been at Heritage as Ed Follner's Chief of Staff during 2005 when President Bush boldly tried to reform Social Security reform. And really the reason Tim and I saw the vision for Heritage Action, the reason that the Heritage Board saw the need to create Heritage Action was I am convinced that if we had organized the grassroots, if we had had the Sentinel program in 2004, President Bush would have been successful in reforming Social Security reform, Social Security. The reason is first, we were working extraordinarily closely with the Bush administration. Every day they were calling us up, talking about where they needed help, talking about the president going and giving a speech in Youngstown, Ohio, and saying, can Heritage help people show up? Can Heritage make sure that there's people there, getting the president's back, pushing back on the people on the left who would say ridiculous things about what the president was trying to do? And our answer always had to be, we're sorry, we're a 501c3 organization, we're not allowed to do grassroots lobbying. And the second thing that would happen is courageous members of Congress would come back. I remember Chris Chicola from Indiana, who held an event in his very purple district, had huge crowds come up, had the newspaper editorial board in his district coming out, a liberal newspaper saying we need to reform Social Security. And he went into his leadership and said, guys, now's the time, we can do it. I am convinced that if we can do it in my district, we can do it all around the country. And the congressional leadership told them, we're not going to do it. There's not enough support out there. We'll get our butts kicked in the next election. That's why I know that if we had the Sentinel program, if we had 17,000 people with influence networks in their women's conservative clubs, in their Tea Parties, in their Republican groups, of 2.5 million people listening to our Sentinels, we could have gotten Social Security reform across the finish line. And it's going to be that pressure to get good policy across the finish line, to get the back of courageous members of Congress when they're doing the right thing, that's going to be even more important in the next 4 or 8 years than it has been in the last 6 years. Right after the election, we had our Sentinel Summit down in San Antonio. I was a little bit worried about the imagery of the Alamo. Was hoping it wasn't going to end that way for us. I was a little bit worried if the election had gone another way that nobody would have showed up and we would have had a big hotel and not a lot of people. But it was fantastic. We have a little video that I want to show that I think will give you a sense of the quality and the energy that existed at Sentinel Summit.
Dedication, by definition, is commitment to a purpose. Sentinel is totally and completely dedicated to the defense of freedom and conservative principles. And we are uncompromising in our effort to make sure that freedom is defended. The Constitution is clear. We are to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. This is the American dream. And to protect it requires real work and constant vigilance. From you, from me, and from us together as Sentinel Nation. Together, Sentinel is going to stop the cronyism. We are going to stop the favoritism, and we are going to grow our movement We will embrace bold and new ideas respecting freedom and liberty for everyone. Sentinel, we are strong and we are here.
The Sentinel program exists to support people like our speaker at today's lunch. Principled, courageous politicians who come to Washington for all the right reasons and are actually part of the process of draining the swamp. And before I bring up a good friend of ours to introduce our speaker today, I want to put up some information you all have seen on how you can ask questions. You can text message questions, as you know, to, is the number up there? 202-600-9709. You need to put the word Sasse, our speaker's last name, Sasse, and then your question. So it would be Sasse, what are we going to do to get great policy passed in Washington? So feel free to do it. If you're not comfortable text messaging, there's pens and paper on your table. We can do it the old-fashioned way as well. To introduce our next speaker is somebody who I greatly admire. He's somebody who is informed. He's never been afraid to ask a tough question, to tell me when he thinks we're doing something wrong, and has become a very valued and trusted supporter of ours at Heritage Action and friend of mine and advisor in the types of decisions that we've been making for the last 6.5 years. George Meyer is a native of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He graduated from Stanford University, then served 2 tours as a naval officer in Vietnam. He earned his MBA from Harvard. I guess he didn't like the weather at Stanford, and has worked in real estate development for the next 45 years. He's married to Sally, has 3 grown sons, and lives in Essex, Connecticut. He's a proud Heritage Foundation supporter for nearly 30 years, following in his father George's footsteps, who was a President's Club member since Heritage's inception. George, will you come join us and introduce our speaker? Where's George? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mike. I am delighted to be here at this, stimulative, informative, and wonderful celebratory President's Club meeting. And I am particularly delighted to be able to introduce our Senator Ben Sasse as our speaker today. I first heard Senator Sasse speak when he was candidate Sasse at a Club for Growth meeting in 2014, and he was great. I knew that as a passionate advocate of limited government, that he was someone all of us at Heritage would want to see in the United States Senate. Asked why he was running for the Senate, he stated that we need to tell the truth about entitlements and figure out how to create an opportunity society that has citizens, neighbors, communities, and businesses building the future, as opposed to the dependency, expansion culture we are living through in Washington right now. As he wrote in his excellent book, Falling in Love with America Again, Jim DeMint, you may have heard of him, said, the federal government, a $3.5 trillion organization, that's a size that's hard to comprehend, is not only too big to succeed, it is too big to oversee and too big to control. Well, that's a problem. But as we have been hearing over the last few days, with a Republican president and Republican majorities in both the House and Senate, we have an opportunity to reduce the scope of the federal government. Senator Sasse brings an impressive set of credentials to this task. Besides being a 5th-generation Nebraskan with a wife and 3 children, Senator Sasse holds 5 academic degrees, including a PhD in history from Yale. He has experience in business, the Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey & Company, the federal government in both the legislative and executive branches, and academia, where as president of Midland University, against all odds, he turned around a failing college. Sean Hannity has said that of all the Senate candidates he interviewed, that Sasse was by far the most impressive. In his maiden speech on the Senate floor, Senator Sasse spoke of the need to avoid robotic recitation of talking points, and the soundbite culture in favor of greater debate on more substantive ideas. He noted that the Congress has only a 9% approval rating, and in the public believes its members are not doing their job. When I read this, it reminded me of a story that an Oklahoma congressman in the 1980s, Mike Sinar, told after being asked to address a group of Cub Scouts in his hometown about what the U.S. Congress does. Not sure how to begin and not knowing what the Cub Scouts knew about Congress, Mike decided to start by asking them a question: what they thought the difference was between Congress and the Cub Scouts. Apparently, one little boy raised his hand and said, "We have adult supervision." Well, Senator Sasse is bringing adult supervision to the Congress that it sorely needs. It should come as no surprise that Senator Sasse has a 97% approval rating on Heritage Action's legislative scorecard, or that he hired Derek Morgan as his chief of staff. Derek was previously Vice President of Economic Freedom and Opportunity at the Heritage Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a principled, thoughtful conservative, Senator Ben Sasse.
Thank you. Thanks for those kind words. Thank you, Senator DeMint, Mike, the rest of Team Heritage. Thanks for having me. Or, as the comment was made as he exited the stage, what happened to the other 3%? The gap between 97 and 100%. And it hurts because Mike Lee says that to me every day on the floor, the guy who currently has the 100% number with you all. The 9% approval rating of Congress. My wife regularly says, who are those 9% and how can she set them straight? We're a little bit unique. I'm one of only 5 people, I think, in the U.S. Senate who's never been a politician before. I've never run for anything before in my life until being elected to this. And we commute every week. And so I live in a farm town about an hour outside of Omaha, where I grew up. And we have 3 little kids, 15, 13, and 5. And we are the only family in the Senate, I think, trying to do a family commute. So if you're the only one doing something you're doing, it usually means you're a naive rookie. There's usually a reason not to be truly unique in the world. But we have 3 little kids. And if we moved here, I can't figure out where they would do ag labor. Like, I can't figure out where they would walk beans into tassel corn. And where I'm from, that's the only way to be sure that your kids get character, is to make them suffer every morning at 5 a.m. And yet, I don't want to be away from them all week, every week. So I bring a kid back and forth with me most weeks, since the Senate will probably adjourn this week, but it's not clear when, or as many people in Nebraska say, when the Senate goes out, they can take their hand off their pocketbook again. When we go out at the end of this week, it's uncertain when it might be Saturday night or Sunday or sometime. So I don't have a kid with me this week, so I'm feeling a little bit lonely. But usually I am the commuting dad of the U.S. Senate. And I was thinking in that introduction, the difference between the Cub Scouts and Washington, D.C., or the difference between the Congress and the Cub Scouts. And it sort of brought back to mind for me a previous traveler to Washington, Alexis de Tocqueville. I want to talk a little bit about economic change today, but I want to pause for a minute and talk about the American idea, which isn't exactly what I'd intended to speak about, but it sets up saying thank you to a lot of you. You know, in the 1830s and 40s, there was a new economic dynamism in America that Europeans really couldn't make any sense of. You know, we tend to think of the beginning of the American experience as our birthday. Every kid knows July 4th, 1776, and adults know, well, the Declaration wasn't the day that the Revolutionary War ended, but in the 1780s, the war finally came to an end, and we tried the Articles of Confederation, and it didn't really work. And then the Constitution is written in 1787, 1788. So we sort of, as American history nerds and civic investors like all of you are, we lock the beginning of America to the 1770s, 1780s in our heads. Europeans didn't really do that. They didn't really think America was truly independent until after the War of 1812. They thought there'd been this sort of temporary suspension of the fighting, sort of like extended time play in a bad soccer game. They sort of thought of the world as the Brits were distracted. They had mercenary fighters, the Hessians. They had a king that was sort of crazy. They were distracted by war in France. And it isn't really until after the War of 1812 that Europeans think that America is a truly independent place. And they looked at us and they thought, well, that's interesting. There's this new place on the frontier of the earth, and they believe in religious liberty. They believe in these crazy ideas about freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, but there's no reason that their cultural pluralism will lead them to be any kind of economic power that we Europeans will ever need to grapple with. And then 20 years later, after we win the War of 1812, it's the 1830s, and America is becoming this incredibly dynamic economy. And the Europeans are trying to make sense of this. Why would this be that all these religious zealots on the frontier of the earth are all of a sudden creating all of these new things? There's a canal revolution, and there's a transportation revolution. There's an early railroad revolution. There's something that will sort of be the forerunner of industrialization with the putting out revolution in the way new products are being constructed. And so in the 1830s and 40s, all of a sudden America is really, really dynamic. And these Europeans said, why could this be? Why is this happening? It must be because they have the best bureaucrats. This was their assumption, right? I mean, if something works well, there must be somebody who's centrally planning the whole thing. And Alexis de Tocqueville was really a travel writer. The right way to think about him, if you own the book Democracy in America, it's 1,500 pages long, and it's great and it's important to read, but it feels really redundant. It feels incredibly boring, like the guy didn't have an editor. And as somebody who wrote a 520-page dissertation, because I didn't have time to write a 220-page dissertation, I can relate to why you would have this 1,500-page book that's under-edited. If you own it, rip the binding off it and lay it in 5 to 7-page chunks around your house like magazine articles, because that's the way it was actually written. Democracy in America is Tocqueville's attempt to come to the US as a travel reporter and write back to Europeans, and to France in particular, and explain America to them. And when Tocqueville was trying to make sense of economic dynamism and opportunity here, he traveled to Washington, D.C., because he thought this must be where it was all centrally planned, where the magic clockmaker sat. And he got here and he said, I went to find the center of America. I went to find the meaning of America. And so I went to Washington, D.C., and I found a nearly uninhabitable swamp filled with lots of people that weren't that creative or interesting. Not a lot has changed in 200 years. And he said, I need to find the real meaning of America. And at that point, there were 25 states. And so Tocqueville left Washington, D.C., and he went out and he went to 17 of the 25 states. And he wrote back to Europe and he said, I have found the meaning of America. It's the Rotary Club. He was serious. He said, I had this big misconception and the balloon was punctured. I used to think of the world as a continuum between isolated individualists, people who live alone and have no friends, or people that have community, and that must be defined by government and by central planning. And he said, this was the wrong way to think about the world. These Americans have this gigantic, ginormous, I don't know, it's a 13-year-old girl's word that just snuck into my head from my children, a gigantic middle space where they believe in community, but they actually believe that community isn't primarily done by compulsion. It isn't done by force. It's done by persuasion. It's done by love. It's done by building better products and better services and persuading people to buy your product, persuading people to marry you, persuading people to join your church or synagogue, persuading people that they should join your venture philanthropy project or your charity. The meaning of America is about people coming together to live out a life of gratitude by serving their neighbor in ways that persuade their neighbor that this is a win-win situation, not by trying to grab the levers of power in the state and prohibit everybody who doesn't want to buy the product that the lobbyists have tried to get Congress to decree that you must buy on Obamacare. Right? What Tocqueville was seeing was that the heart of America is about these wonderfully civically minded people. It's about recognizing that the gap between the Congress and the Boy Scouts, or the gap between Washington, D.C. as compulsory, or the towns that you come from that are centered on persuasion, that gap is what really defines the heart of America. And so I want to just begin by saying thank you for the ways that you invest. Thank you for the ways that you support the Heritage Foundation, the important policy work that is done here, the important advocacy work that is done here. I'm prohibited by Senate rules for asking for money on behalf of anybody else, but there's no prohibition on me as an individual citizen for telling you thank you for the ways that you invest, because I think my kids and my community benefit from it, and I know that I and my team and my current calling benefit from the work of the Heritage Foundation. So thank you for your investment. You know, I was talking to Bob Pennington before I came up here, and I asked him how he got connected to Heritage or why he first became invested in Washington, D.C. and in causes here. And he said, as a businessman 30 years ago, I'm trying to remember the time frame, I think you're saying mid to late 80s. He said, as a businessman, I looked at Washington and I couldn't understand why it didn't work. I couldn't understand why it was so clunky, but especially I couldn't understand why it didn't work when it had this glorious document that is supposed to structure it. And the ways that you all invest in a Heritage Foundation and in American heritage that understands the glories of this document, that is in peril. We are not doing the hard work of cultural catechesis, of teaching our kids what America is about. Because what America is about, the old Lincoln line about how the Constitution is a silver frame around the golden apple that is the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution is the most beautiful political document that's ever been written. Why? Because it's a negative document, and political documents can't define the heart of your life or meaning. The political document that is the Constitution is a document that starts by affirming pre-political things about the fact that government is not what gives us rights. Government is not where you find community. The tragedy of 4 years ago in the presidential election of 2012, when President Obama was asked, do you believe in American exceptionalism? Do you remember this? You could sort of watch the wheels turning in his head, and he's thinking, well, of course I don't believe in American exceptionalism, but it's a campaign year, and I don't think I'm allowed to say that. And so he sort of pauses a little bit, and he says, well, yes, I believe in American exceptionalism, the same way that the Brits probably believe in British exceptionalism, and the same way that the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. Well, that kind of misses the whole point. But you can see what he was probably worried about. He was worried about saying something that said Americans are superior to other people. That's not what American exceptionalism means. American exceptionalism is an affirmation of a historical reality that our founding is a gloriously special moment in human history where our founders came together and said something really audacious. They said most people across human history have believed that government gives you rights. We don't believe that. We believe that God gives us rights by nature, and government is our shared project to secure those rights. We believe that 7 billion people are created with dignity because they're created. And that affirmation of human dignity leads us to a shared project for the 320 million Americans to come together and try to make sure that our government exists to secure the rights of people when they could be abridged in a fallen world. They could be abridged by violent neighbors, and they could be abridged by an overly expansive, intrusive government. And so the American exceptionalism that we understand distinguishes between community and government. Another horrible thing that was said in that 2012 presidential campaign is that regularly the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, ran ads that said, government is just another word for those things we choose to do together. No, it isn't. Community is the word for things we choose to do together. Government is another word for a compulsory organization. And that compulsory organization is necessary. We're not anarchists in this room. We believe that government has all sorts of important responsibilities to secure our rights, but they're limited. And that's what the Constitution is about. The Constitution doesn't begin by telling us our rights. Our rights are pre-political. The Constitution begins by us telling the government what its limited powers are. When you're teaching your kids and grandkids about the American experiment, Our founders were basically saying, build on the whiteboard of your study in your house where the kids do the homework, 2 pictures of an island surrounded by an ocean. And the pre-American idea was that the island are the limited rights that governments choose to give to people. The king was the guy in most of world history that had a monopoly on violence. The king is the guy who's truly free. He can do whatever he wants. And the government then decides what limited rights the people get. And the American founders said, that has it exactly backwards. Actually, the order of things is that people are free first, and we grant to the government limited enumerated powers. And the glories of that Constitution are a system that says the rights of the people are limitless because the powers of government are limited, not the reverse. Well, here's the tragedy of the moment we face. We're not teaching our kids any of that stuff right now. There's a lot we can talk about national politics and about economic disruption. I'm going to mention a tiny bit of that before we pivot to questions. But the really big horror stat in American life today is that 41% of Americans under age 35, almost half, 41% of Americans under age 35, tell pollsters now that they think the First Amendment is dangerous because you might use your freedom of speech to say something that would hurt someone else's feelings. It's sort of funny because the safe space movement is so tragic that you have to mock it, but really, this is a horror in a republic. Because the American experiment is actually about being able to say things that might hurt someone else's feelings. Not because we want to be uncivil, not because we want to be rude, but because we don't want to give the government the power to police proper and improper speech. Our forefathers and foremothers came here because they differed about really, really important things. They differed about the nature of God and revelation and salvation and heaven and hell, really important stuff. And they said, we actually think conscience and freedom and debate and persuasion are so important that we're going to build our polity around the idea that we wouldn't try to use violence, even at the hands of the state, to squash dissent. We want a diversity of opinions so that people can fight out the really important things by persuasion when you invite other people to your worship services or over dinner or even maybe sometimes shouting in the town square. But we think that dissent and that debate are glorious reflections of the dignity of people who have minds and souls and wills. And we're not teaching that to the next generation right now. We are building an unbelievably fragile young population. And when you look at the level of economic disruption that's coming, the history nerd in me actually thinks I actually think we live at a really, really interesting moment. That's not to say it's not scary, because it's scary. In the history of the world, you had hunter-gatherers, and then you had settled agrarian farmers, and then about 150 years ago, we had the rise of big tool economies. And what we have happening now is a transformation in the economy that's going to lead to disruptions in the nature of work unseen in recorded human history. I'm a historian by training, and usually that means my job is to be a skunk at a garden party. And when everybody says anything's really unprecedented, the historian's job is to walk up and say, no, actually, it's not that unprecedented. You just think it's really unprecedented because you're a narcissist and you're at this moment. But in this case, we really do live at an unprecedented moment. In the history of the world, people basically never chose their job until about 150 years ago. Mom and dad were hunter-gatherers, we will be hunter-gatherers. We were fish swimming in a sea. You didn't know you were making a choice. That's how you survived. And eventually, people in the Fertile Crescent sat down and they began to farm. And from 10,000 years ago until 150 years ago, almost everybody farmed. And mom and dad farmed, and so you would farm. And there was a big disruption in the world from 1870 to about 1920. Where a whole bunch of people left the farm and went to cities and got jobs in factories. And it was really scary. And it upended American politics in fundamental ways. And as the dad of 13 and 15-year-old girls, let me just affirm those people that 15 to 25-year-old males migrant across the landscape is a scary, scary disruptive thing. And yet when people got to the cities and got a new job, they tended to have that same job until death or retirement. And so the big disruptive moment that led to progressivism, that led to a transformation of American politics at the hands of both Democrat Woodrow Wilson and Republican Teddy Roosevelt, the big disruptive moment in American politics that frankly threatened the idea of individual liberty, that threatened the idea that we all believe in common, that government shouldn't define meaning. Government should create a framework so you all can define meaning, and so we can argue about meaning with our neighbors. The American idea was almost swamped in those years of mid-industrialism and early progressivism. And yet it turned out once people got to factories, they got a new job, and the social capital, the dense relational networks of villages were recreated in urban networks in their neighborhoods. What's happening now is the thing that people feared was happening 150 years ago, which is that work relationships are going to become more transient than ever before. As recently as the late 1970s, average duration at a firm for a head of household, a primary wage earner for a family, was still decades long, 25, 30 years. Anybody want to hazard a guess what average duration at a firm is right now in the US? It's about 3.5 years. And it's getting shorter every year. And people are scared, and we haven't done the hard work of admitting that the amount of disruption that's coming is gigantic. Nobody in human history has ever been a lifelong learner, or no civilization has ever been populated by lifelong learners. We have before us the task of making sure everybody becomes a lifelong learner. And government is going to try hard to fill the vacuum of anxiety and uncertainty people feel by saying, trust us, we're the government. We can centrally plan this. We can take that old French view before Tocqueville visited here and recreate the idea that government can be your big brother and give you comfort in times of anxiety. It isn't true, but it will be a siren song. I want to go to question and answer, but I want to say this one important factual thing to have in common as we pivot to it. I'm from the most productive land on the face of the earth. You all know us just because we're great at football, but we actually also think of ourselves as feeding the world. Nebraska isn't just a corn state. We are the largest cattle state in the union by poundage now, too, so take that, you Texans. But that doesn't mean there's not radical change in agriculture. There is. 90% of our population in America was farming at the end of the Revolution. 1790, 90% of Americans were farmers. By 1840, it was down to 69%. By 1900, it was down to 38%. By the Kennedy administration, it was down to 8%. Today, it is 2%. We produce far more food now with 2% of the population than we did with 90% of the population in the 1790s. The same trend lines are happening in manufacturing. At the beginning of the Civil War, less than 10% of Americans were involved in manufacturing. By the 1950s, it got to 30%. It's back down to 7%. Yet our manufacturing output is as high as it's ever been, but it's 7% of the population. People are scared about the disruption that's coming in the nature of work, and the hard work that we need to do, we conservatives, we market-oriented people, those of us who believe that rights are pluripolitical, and especially you people at the Heritage Foundation that have held the government accountable, need to take the long-term view of talking about the America of 10 and 20 and 30 years in the future that's still the most economically opportunistic, in the best sense of the word, economically vibrant, innovative population on Earth, and that still believes in all we believe about rights and about the fact that the center of the world is the communities you come from, not this city. And that requires a long-term perspective. And I'm really grateful for the kind of investments that you make in an organization like the Heritage Foundation that has the conscience of so much of this movement at its hands. Thanks for having me, and let's turn to questions.